Greetings, dear viewers, and welcome to Mengizem Media. My guests today are UK-based writer, director, and charity worker Graham Peebles and chairman of Amhara Association of America, Tewdros Tirfe. We will discuss about the special short documentary film titled We Are Still Breathing, Amhara Genocide in Ethiopia, directed by Graham Peebles, which is recipient of the Global Film Festival Awards Award for Best Documentary and the World Film Festival in Cannes Award for Best Human Rights Film. Please stay with us. Thank you so much for joining me, my guests.
Reeyot, thank you for having us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me start from Tewdros. What is the purpose of the film and Triple-A's contribution to prepare this film?
Well, Reeyot, as an organization, majority up until the war in northern Ethiopia, when the TPLF invaded the Amhara region and vast human rights atrocities were committed by the TPLF fighters, majority of our reporting was primarily in Oromia, specifically in Walega, Horogurudu, East Walega areas, and there were massive human rights atrocities being committed against Amhara civilians by the Oromo Liberation Army, the Oromia Special Forces, and even the federal military forces, oftentimes in collaboration with local government officials. And we felt that these crimes were underreported and not getting enough attention. And we had documented enough human rights violations there that we believed amounted to a genocide. Over 2 million Amharas had been displaced from that area. Tens of thousands of Amharas had been killed. And one of the things that we felt that we could do to bring attention to this genocide was doing a documentary, showing the tragedy of this situation of, in Ethiopia. So, and over time we had developed a partnership with Graham. Graham had been covering Ethiopia for a very long time. And then he has started investigating and writing articles about the human rights violations against Amharas in this area. So we had a conversation about doing a documentary. AAA had commissioned a documentary a few years back and on the Maikadra massacre, when the TPLF fighters had killed over 1,500 fighters. We had this discussion with Graham. Graham was open to doing this. Graham had experience in doing documentaries in Ethiopia in the past. We knew that this was going to be a very risky endeavor, but he was willing to take on that task. And so we were able to reach out to our donors, and they were willing to fund this project. And there was a lot of process that went into in terms of like how the approach of the documentary, what we were going to do, who were going to be the key figures in the documentary. There was a lot of discussion. And then finally Graham and his team were able to go to Ethiopia, do the filming, and then finish producing and directing. And really now it's it's out. It's been screened in several theaters, and we're very proud that this film has won these prestigious awards by the Global Film Festival and the World Film Festival. It's really incredible, and it shows, and it's a testament really to Graham as a filmmaker, as a journalist, and also all the team members from AAA and the donors coming together to put this documentary together. And the fact that these prestigious organizations awarded this documentary these awards. It's really something that we all should be proud of. And now more and more people, especially non-Ethiopians, now know what's happening to Amhara civilians, especially in the Oromia region.
Mm-hmm. Congratulations, both. Graham, as a director of the film, what do you feel when you have made it and now after winning 2 awards?
Well, I'm delighted that the film has been recognized and won the awards. It's an amazing thing to have done, I think. I didn't actually know that because AAA had made the submissions to the film festivals, I didn't know that they were going on. So when Teddy told me last week, I was completely surprised and delighted. You know, the hope would be that the awards raise the profile of the film and therefore are able to spread the message about the purpose of the film, which is to raise awareness of something which is not really very well known, what's going on in Ethiopia at all. So, you know, that's the purpose. And as Teddy said, you know, amongst non-Ethiopians, it receives virtually no coverage in mainstream media, or very little, although that seems to be changing. I have to say that the last few months there's been, you know, I noticed there was a report published recently by Human Rights Watch. There's been various pieces on Al Jazeera, Amnesty International have highlighted what's taking place. So perhaps, you know, this is the right time for the film to be aired in such a way that it would ride on the back of that growing awareness. So yeah, I'm delighted it won the awards. It was, I mean, for anybody who's made a film, they'll know it's a hellish occupation, which, you know, it takes forever, and it's very, very complicated and so on. So it took a long time. We were saying it was last March when we first spoke.
Yeah.
That's a year ago. The film was finished, I guess, November. It must have been November because the first screenings were in December. So, you know, the actual filming doesn't take very long. We were only in Ethiopia I was there for 8 days. So, but the editing, finding a way of piecing it together, what information do you include, what do you leave out, how much information do you need to include so that people can make sense of what's taking place without overloading the film. So yeah, but I was very pleased with the results. I think, you know, it was very difficult. The filming was difficult. We were filming in one of the internal displacement camps within Amhara. So the conditions were very hard. We couldn't spend a great deal of time there because we didn't want to attract attention to ourselves and to the people who were facilitating the filming. So there was a time pressure as well. And the other thing that I didn't really sort of note this until I was editing the film, but as we were doing the interview, so I would be asking questions and a translator would be asking the people that we were talking to the question in Amharic, and they would answer in Amharic. And the translator would give me a short summary of what they said, but not the details. So, you know, it was, and then when all of the interviews were translated, then I could see more or less, you know, what the people had been saying, and it became even more shocking. What these people, we focused on 4 people in the film, trying to cover a range of different experiences that people have had. So they'd all been displaced, obviously, but they'd all been displaced in different ways. They'd seen different things. Some had witnessed the slaughter of family members. Others had been physically attacked themselves. So we tried to represent what's happening more broadly through the 4 people that we spoke to.
Thank you. Tewdros, as you know, the world remember Rwandan genocide 30 years. In Ethiopia, already many people have been killed because of their ethnicity, as described by Graham. Now, to prevent more killings and to change this bad reality before it turns to the worst, what are the other solutions? Yeah, this helps also by creating awareness, making film. What are another solutions?
You know, Reeyot, that's an excellent question. And that's what we hope to try to do by doing this documentary, because we've been, one of the, primary things that we do as an organization is, we have a team of investigators in Ethiopia who obviously investigate human rights violations, document them, and report them, and we make these reports available, to the public, human rights organizations, policymakers, and as such. But this film, this documentary, is another way to reach a broader public, to educate them. It's only when people are educated and are aware of what's happening that you can build up, enough, mass mobilization, to stop, what's going on. These essentially targeted genocide against innocent people. But until you build up that awareness, it's very, very difficult. And when this documentary now has been shown across the globe, these film festivals, more and more people will become aware, and that gives us an opportunity to educate decision makers, so that there could be pressure on the Abiy regime, to stop the killing of innocent civilians in Ethiopia. That's what we hope to do. There's, this is actually, obviously, in tandem with all the other activities that we do as an organization, but also really Amharas in the across the whole diaspora. But in order to do this, as I was saying earlier, we need, also non-Amharas to join, to be part of this advocacy effort. And that's what we hope this film will do. And after you do that, you can have, it makes it much more easier to introduce legislation, use international institutions such as the African Union, the United Nations, to put pressure on the Abiy regime. But this type of documentary helps, educate, bring awareness, and put the pressure that's needed on the Abiy regime.
Thank you, Teddy. Let's watch from the trailer and we'll come back.
Okay.
Throughout the world, tribal nationalism has infiltrated mainstream politics and poisoned societies.
ብዙ ሰዎች ገድለዋል። ከወንድሜ ልጅ ጋር በአንድ ቀን የገደሉት 13 ሰዎች ናቸው። መተው ከተማ መተው ሲያወሩ ገላው እንዳቃጠሉት ምናምን ፎቶ ላይ አንስተው ለራሳቸው ማለት ነው ከተማ እንትን ሲሉ ነበር። የወንድሜ ልጅ የ15 ዓመት ልጅ ነው።
ያው ልጆቹን ተኛሉ ማቷቸው እዛ ይሄን የሞታውን በስድስት እየተዚያ ማቱት።
Yeah, the stories are very distressing. Ram, you traveled to Ethiopia and met with the victims. Please tell us about their overall situation.
Well, when we went, so the internal displacement camps, I mean, this term, camps, is a very misleading one, I think. Mm-hmm. Because if we talk about refugee camps or internal displacement camps and so on, I think the image that people have, particularly in the West, is often of quite well organized centers with UNICEF tents and, cooking facilities and washrooms and toilets and so on. The place that we went to when we first arrived, they were semi-industrial units. Well, they were previously industrial units, sort of Amazon warehouse type structures. And the first day we went just to say hello and to find out if it was practical for us to work there. We went into one of the units. It's huge. I mean, and so there's no windows. So there's no light. There's no fresh air. The only light there comes through the door when it's opened. And we walked in, so it's very difficult to see. And when I first looked around, I thought it was a storage unit, because everywhere you look, there was just piles and piles and piles of stuff, of people's belongings. But then as one's eyes adjusted to the subdued lighting, then I could see that actually in between the stuff, there were people. There was a family, there might be a mother and 2 children or a baby, and right next to them, another family or another group of people. And with all their belongings. So there's no privacy whatsoever. I've worked in lots of refugee camps, and they have there's a universal sort of smell that they have. I suppose it's to do with the water, and so there's that smell in the camp as well. It was a mess. There'd been quite a lot of rain in the area when we were there, and there's no pavements or anything, so it was thick mud. So it was very difficult to move around the camp. The small number of toilets, the kind of thing that in the West you'd have at a music festival. There are not very many of them. So people have to collect water and then wash. And so overcrowding, poor facilities, children everywhere. From what I could see, it seemed to be, I would say, 50–60% of the people there were children. And then women and some men. And that's nothing to do. So, not only have people gone through the trauma of losing their homes, being displaced, witnessing dreadful atrocities, they're now in a refugee camp. And the clip that you just shown, that man, so he must be in his 70s, I guess. And it's interesting, in cases like this, we tend to think about the children more often than not, and it is terrible for them. They've got they're out of school. The trauma that they've experienced will stay with them for the rest of their lives. But it's also incredibly difficult for people of that gentleman's age. So his whole life, he had a home, he had land, had a big family, and now he has nothing. It's absolutely devastating, I think. So the conditions in the camp were pretty awful. There was a small presence from UNICEF, some tents, but nothing really. Some education programs going on, but I filmed one of it. There was maybe 80 children in one classroom. Chaos, absolute chaos. So yeah, very, very difficult. And now I understand that people are being driven out of these camps and forced to go back to the places that they were displaced from in the first place. A place where they've lost that. I mean, interesting. Everybody that I spoke to, I would ask them at some point in the conversation, what would you like to happen now, in the future? And everybody wanted to go home. So they are now being sent home, but there's no home there. Their home has either been stolen or destroyed. The people who carried out the atrocities are still there. And from what I hear, they are just put in other temporary structures which have less facilities than the camps that they're being driven away from. So I don't really understand the purpose behind that, other than the government is just trying to present some kind of fiction that it's safe to go back to the area and you've nothing to worry about, which of course isn't the case at all. I wanted, if I could just pick up on something that Teddy said just now, is that in the clip you just shown, the young girl who we interviewed, at the end of our discussion, I said to her, how do you think things will change? How will this be resolved? Would you be able to forgive the people who have carried out these atrocities? And do you think there can be reconciliation within the country without forgiveness? And she said no, she didn't think there could be peace without forgiveness, but she wouldn't be able to forgive them. And it was, it was an interesting conversation. And absolutely understand how difficult it would be to forgive people for doing the things that they've done. But, unless there is some kind of reconciliation in the country, then the divisions and the violence and the conflict will probably continue. There needs to be international pressure, and publicity hopefully will help to bring that about. But then there needs to be accountability, and there's virtually no accountability. So, within the government is clearly at fault. Whether they are actively carrying out the genocide or not is a different thing. But certainly the regional authority are behind the atrocities, or are facilitating at least. And even if the federal government isn't driving what's happening, and they, you two will know more about that than I, but their neglect and makes them complicit anyway. So I think there needs to be accountability, there needs to be reconciliation, and that will involve some kind of forgiveness. People have lived within Ethiopia from different tribal ethnic groups for generations quite happily. And I think the gentleman in the film, he is Amhara, but he was married to an Oromo woman. And I know that's commonplace. So people are used to living side by side in harmony. It's the politicians and the tribal fanatics who are driving a wedge in communities and causing this discord. But it's very, very sad.
I think just to pick up on what Graham said, Reeyot, when you ask, people who have been displaced from their homes, who have seen their loved ones killed in front of them, as that young lady in that clip said, a family member of hers was burnt after he was killed, and the killers took pictures of his corpse to keep for themselves, and so she's now living in an IDP camp, as Graham described it. You can't consider that a camp. It's not safe, and so it's very difficult for someone like that to think about forgiving when she's still in pain. The title of the film, "We're Still Breathing," came from that woman, because she said after going through all of this, they're still, she said, we're still breathing, and so there is hope, for these people. They're still alive, and that hope rests on people like us doing something, trying to make a positive difference for them, and we hope that this documentary makes that positive difference. These people that are being now forced to relocate into the Oromia region, they're not being sent home. They're being relocated to some other places that they're not familiar with. They're not being provided adequate housing. There's no security. In fact, they're being sent back under the same security apparatus that committed these atrocities against their families. They're being re-victimized. So to force these people to live is incredible. And then think about it. They were displaced. They come into the Amhara region. And then in Amhara region, there's a war right now. The war that was started in, around July of last year, of 2023. There was, the state of emergency that was declared in August of 2023. And then in February of this year, that state of emergency, has been extended. And so they went from a war zone into another war zone, and now back into that, into another war zone. So how can anyone expect them to, to forgive at this time? And it's really very tragic, very tragic. It's very sad what's happening. But that's why, especially those of us who are Amharas, who live in the diaspora, we need to do everything that we can, to raise awareness, and that's what we try to do as an organization. You know, when you look right now at what's happening in the Amhara region, it is Habis military and the federal military that is committing, you know, raping women, extrajudicial killings. You know, Graham was talking about the reports that came out recently from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, coverage by, you know, major international medias about the Marawi massacre, about the extrajudicial killings in Bahar Dar, the drone attacks. These drone attacks mainly are on civilian, you know, targets. These are targeted attacks against innocent Amharas. Over nearly 3 million children who are now out of school. The internet has been completely shut down since August of 2023. When people think of internet being shut down, they think of, oh, people can't get online. No, internet is very vital for emergency responders to be able to respond. Internet is very vital for hospitals to be able to operate. Internet is very vital to have economic vitality. And it's not just internet being shut down. In many cases, even mobile and, you know, landline telephone lines are being shut down when atrocities are being committed. And these atrocities are being committed by the federal military. So, you know, we hope that this film will help bring awareness, not just what happened to the Amhara people in Oromia, but now broadly really what's happening to Amharas across all of Ethiopia. Because you know, as we had documented as an organization and validated by other human rights organizations, including the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, that tens of thousands of Amharas across Ethiopia, you know, have been rounded up and put into makeshift camps, you know, with horrible living conditions where communicable diseases are rampant. So, you know, we really have to do all that we can, you know, to raise awareness, and really have to thank Graham for, you know, taking a risk, you know, to do this, because, you know, Graham forgot to mention that we had to postpone his trip and the trip of the camera person, I think maybe twice, because the fighting had started. We had planned on having Graham travel, you know, around March or April, but that's when, you know, the decision was made to dissolve the Amhara Special Forces. The protests were happening. Fighting has started. We had to postpone Graham's trip and the camera person's trip from London to Ethiopia. And then we had to find, you know, right opportunity for them to travel. And then, you know, imagine traveling to Amhara region. I think it was around maybe June. Yeah. And active fighting that was happening across Amhara region at that time.
It's a very courageous act. Graham, what is the driving force to do this?
Strange question, isn't it? I think I have a connection with Ethiopia generally. I first went to Ethiopia in 2006.
Ogaden?
I was running charity projects. And I'd met somebody. I was running charity projects in Sri Lanka after the tsunami. And I met somebody, an Ethiopian woman in London by chance, literally on the street. And she was selling artifacts from Ethiopia to raise money for her family's NGO in Addis. And we started talking, and I told her what I'd been doing. And she said, could we meet? We met, and then she invited me, would I come to Addis to run projects? And I worked with street children and under 18 commercial sex workers in Addis. First of all, I went for 6 weeks, and I ended up living there for 2 years. So that started a close relationship with the country. And in London, I've worked with lots of Ethiopian refugees and done lots of things. And then when I started writing, one of the first subjects that I wrote about was Ethiopia. And I think probably over the years, I've written more about Ethiopia than anything else. Maybe, I don't know how many articles, 40, 50 articles, maybe more. You know, the EPRDF through until, and then the celebration, you know, that period of hope and optimism when Abiy came in and you know, we swept aside these monsters, and people returned to the country and within the diaspora, and there was such an energy of hope, and of course it was seen very quickly to be misguided, and actually these, you know, the Abiy regime, many people seem to think that it's worse than it was under the EPRDF. So I don't know whether it is or not, but it's certainly another dictatorship. He seems to be a rampant narcissist, like all dictators become, whether they are to that way in the first time. I mean, every photograph you see of Abiy is he's grinning from ear to ear, and the country is on its knees, you know. And so I think these people live in denial of what's going on, whereas they're the actual cause in many ways for what's going on. So, you know, clearly there needs to be a change of government, but that's a long process. You know, and to bring that about, there needs to be, you know, a movement like there was that brought down the EPRDF, you know, where you had tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people protesting on the streets again and again and again and again and again, demanding change. So, you know, we hope that because it has to come from the people. I mean, there needs to be international pressure, but there needs also to be pressure from within Ethiopia itself, and amongst the diaspora. You know, during the 2-year war with the TPLF, which during that time I was, you know, wrote many pieces about the war, and on that occasion, if you read what I'd written, you'd think, okay, I was supporting the government. And in many ways, I was supporting the government because they were being attacked. The country was being attacked by a terrorist group. But the Western media completely distorted the representation of what was taking place. And there was an international campaign of protests around the world organized by the diaspora, which brought awareness to that. And I think, you know, I don't know whether that, you know, something similar could take place regarding what's happening within, not just in Amhara, but more broadly in the country. I mean, somebody wrote to me last week after an article I'd written saying that, talking about young boys, children, essentially being trafficked into forced labor, that seems to be which I didn't know about. You know, so there are lots of things that seem to be happening underneath this umbrella of exploitation and violence, and fear, because that's what these dictators, they create this atmosphere of fear in which people are terrified of doing anything. They take away all their human rights. There's no freedom of assembly, no freedom of the media. All the journalists are arrested. So, you know, there needs to be a massive campaign to raise awareness about what's going on. And the film, you know, I suppose my hope with the film, and particularly when we won these awards, was that the film could act as like a catalyst around which people could be inspired and energized to protest, to act, to demand change.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are excellent points. You know, Graham, you know, I wanted to come back to something that Graham had mentioned, Reeyot. Okay. And, you know, there was a lot of, it's majority of the journalists from the West that cover Ethiopia, they don't know the political dynamics very well at all. Oftentimes they're new. They don't have the history. There's been Western journalists that I've talked to who initially thought that Abiy was an Amhara. And when I corrected them, they were, and I told them his real ethnic identity, they were shocked. They didn't even understand the ethnic government system in Ethiopia. that we consider as an ethnic apartheid system. So you spend a lot of time educating these journalists, and that's why when they're reporting about what's happening in Ethiopia, it's all misconstrued. And then that means what happens is that the Western audience misunderstands a lot of things in Ethiopia. And so the war in northern Ethiopia, when the TPLF started this war and the fighting was happening, there was we believe these Western journalists created a lot of confusion because they like to try to simplify or dumb down what's happening in Africa, or just like really foreign conflicts in general to their audience. Where, when Amharas started fighting against the TPLF, it was because they were invaded, because the TPLF came into Amhara region, the TPLF also into the Afar region. So there were atrocities being committed against Amharas by the TPLF, atrocities being committed against the Afar civilians by the TPLF. And so Amharas had no choice but to respond to these atrocities. And so they came together, and they, other people, like they've done in the past, and established Fanos, which is really a defensive force against an invading force. And in Wollo, in Shiwa, and in Gondar, and in Gojam. So these Amharas were not fighting in support of Abiy. These Amharas were fighting literally to survive and defend themselves from this invading TPLF force that had came into Amhara region. But the Western media completely, they did not understand this dynamic. And so now when there's a war between Amharas right now in Amhara region and Abiy and his and the military, they're confused and they're shocked. And we had been telling them for a long time that the Amharas were fighting their own fight. They were not fighting in support of Abiy. They were fighting to defend themselves against TPLF. And now they're fighting for survival, defending themselves against Abiy and his military. So it takes a lot of time to educate, these journalists, and they're dropped there for a few months. Maybe they might last a year, and then they go on to their next assignment. So there's a lot of education that has to happen. And many Ethiopians think the education is just broader public. No, even the journalists that cover Ethiopia, they don't understand Ethiopia very well. The policymakers that make policy, to come up with policy decisions and implement policy decisions on Ethiopia and Africa in general, do not understand Ethiopia and Africa very well. And so it's our job as those of us here in the diaspora, who understand the democratic process here, who understand these institutions, to be, educate the policymakers, the decision makers, be part of these institutions, provide policy recommendations and have influence, because we know it and we understand it much more than they do. And we're vested in it because we still have family members that live there. For many of us, I still have family members in Wolkite. So the issue of Wolkite is not just only an Amhara issue, but it's also a personal issue because I have family members who live there. So, so to Graham's point, there's still a lot of misunderstanding about Ethiopia. And that's why sometimes, many Ethiopians, they get confused about policies Western policies when it comes to Ethiopia, or even international institutions. But it's really incumbent on us to really be active and be engaged, and not be disengaged. That's the worst thing that we can do, is be disengaged. As difficult as it is sometimes, as frustrating as it might be, you have to be engaged because people are dying. Innocent people are dying. People who need medical attention are not getting medical attention. Women are being raped. Children are becoming orphans, right? This country has become unstable. There are many parts of Ethiopia right now, they have zero government services, especially in the Amhara region, right? We're seeing what's happened in Gambela recently and other southern parts of Ethiopia. we're seeing the regional tensions between Ethiopia and Somalia. So, for us to be disengaged is the worst thing that we can do, for the country and for all of us who have family members in that country.
Terry, I just wanted to come in on something you said there about Western journalists. But it's that, a lot of it is lazy journalism as well. That whether it's and most journalists, even if they're covering Ethiopia, or they might be covering the Horn of Africa, they're probably not even living there. Or they may be in Nairobi, but often they're not even in the country. It's, the mainstream media, they have less and less resources. Investigative journalism takes a lot of time and money, and they're seeing less and less of it. So, and the other thing I wanted to say was, yes, that they might be confused, and I get confused with the Ethiopian political landscape, but genocide's not confusing. The fact that 30, 40, 50,000 people have been massacred, the fact that millions of people have been displaced, the fact that tens of thousands of people have been falsely arrested, that's not complicated. It's the same with Gaza, actually. You hear people debating the issue about Israel's right to defend itself, and that's got nothing to do with that. It's not complicated. Israel is committing genocide. And Abiy and his regime is committing genocide. It's quite clear. So that isn't difficult for a policymaker or a journalist to understand. So then the question is, why don't they then act? It's clear. I'm sure they know what's going on. Why don't they act? So that's a more complicated conversation, I think. And it's, they are lazy. They are Western governments make decisions based on short-term self-interest. So that's why they need to be pressured by the diaspora, by protests on the ground. I mean, and then by publicity with things like this film. And if the film can be seen by policymakers, by decision makers, by mainstream media, this is because it's, I'm sure the majority of people who have seen the film so far have been Ethiopian, which is fine and great. But, we need to try to reach an audience that doesn't really know what's going on. And policymakers that know what's going on, but are ignoring it. So it's all about awareness, I think.
Therefore, if there is also enough knowledge, and if the journalists also present that, there is no difference.
No. The journalists, I mean, the war, when the TPLF started the war in November 2020, I wrote a couple of articles around that time, and I was really confused. I wasn't sure what was going on, and if you read the pieces that I wrote at the time, they were ambiguous. But you have to then have various sources that you absolutely trust, and you go to those sources, and then you can start to understand what does seem to be a very complicated system. There are lots of different political groups, and there's different factions, and what's the difference between a FANU and the militia, and a rebel group, and all these things that these TPLF was described as a rebel group when they first made the attacks in November 2020, and consistently by Western media. They weren't a rebel group. They're a terrorist organization. They always have been. So it's, I think a lot of it is complicated, but then genocide isn't complicated. Human suffering isn't complicated. We can see that, and people should be writing about that. They don't have to make a political judgment. I make a political judgment when I write things because I'm clear about what that judgment is. But if you're not clear, don't make a political judgment, just tell the facts. You know, it's all you have to do. And they won't even do that. I mean, Ethiopia receives virtually no coverage. It's, if you compare it with, I mean, even the conflict in the Sudan has now gone under the radar, but because Gaza has taken over everything. But I think, in a strange way, that the fact of the catastrophe of Gaza, it can highlight the fact that we are living in a world which is rife with violence and conflict. So, on the back of that, growing awareness of what's going on in Gaza, then I do think this is a really opportune moment to make known what's happening in Ethiopia with vigor, you know.
The one thing I wanted to add, Reeyot, is like, you know, in terms of bringing awareness, you know, putting the necessary pressure on, especially, you know, in, you know, for those of us that live in Western governments, to put that pressure. You need to do, you know, you know, several things, not just one thing. So this film is just part of that, you know, component. But, you know, we regularly engage and meet with, you know, policymakers, you know, from the House, the Senate. We meet with the State Department. We had a, you know, over an hour and a half long meeting about a week and a half ago with State Department officials, right? We engage, you know, with human rights organizations. You know, we communicate regularly and try to get more coverage, you know, of what's happening to Amharas in Ethiopia by engaging with, you know, Western journalists. But we also engage in international institutions as part of our attempt to put pressure on the Abiy regime. You know, AAA filed a legal complaint with the African Union, African Commission on Human and People's Rights, along with the Center for Human Rights in Pretoria. And this was in February of 2023. So it's a very, very long process. You know, justice and accountability, you know, it's not quick. It takes a very, very long time. You have to be persistent. Just like this film, you know, took nearly a year to complete, and then finally to start putting it on, you know, in theaters. So there's a lot of things that go into play to really seek justice and accountability. As Graham said, you know, genocide is not complicated. It's right there. It's simple. But you know, unfortunately, what the perpetrators of genocide, in this case of the Amhara people, it's, you know, Abiy and his military. What they try to do is they try to normalize killing. They try to normalize massacre. They try to normalize instability. You know, they try to normalize, you know, raping of women and, you know, and making children orphans. And this is something that we have to push against. And when there's so much distraction that happens with, you know, with you know, what's here in the West with all the you know, what's going on, and not just, you know, with the terrible things that's happening in the world, but also here domestically. And you know, to get attention of what's happening, you know, in Ethiopia is not easy, but it requires us, those of us here in the diaspora, especially, you know, organizations. You have to be persistent. You have to be engaged. You have to be active. The evidence is there. Graham has written many articles about what's happening. You know, AAA, we've published many reports about what's happening. And now we've had even other, you know, human rights organizations publish reports about what's happening to Amharas. The evidence is there. You know, we just need to do our job and keep pushing and pushing. As Graham was saying, be persistent, you know, have a mass mobilization, you know, put the necessary pressure to get these, you know, politicians to act. You know, one of the things that we've been pushing for the State Departments to not allow Ethiopia to be reinstated into AGOA, because we know what they're going to do with the money that they've hired lobbyists paying, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now I think it amounts into millions to try to get reinstated. They're not doing that for, you know, to, you know, economic vitality of, you know, to restart the economic engine in Ethiopia. They're doing that so they can get this money to buy more drones and buy more, you know, weapons. So there is an opportunity here, and you know, especially for the, you know, those of us who live in the U.S. with the 2024 election coming up, we need to be engaged with the candidates that are running for election, get them to see this documentary, as Graham was saying, and provide the facts that are out there about the actual genocide that's been committed, and pressure them to act, and really tag into their morality as well. And so I think if we can do this, we can actually make a difference for these people.
Thank you both. Lastly, if there is anything you want to add on this program, please, Graham.
I think we've said it. I've said it all really that I have to say. I just, it's heartbreaking. It breaks my heart that people are suffering in the way that they are. It really does. And Ethiopia, the people of Ethiopia have suffered so much for so long, under so many different regimes, in so many different ways. There's this violence, the suppression and restriction of human rights going on. But there's tremendous, the poverty remains. The country is unbelievably poor. It's access to education, access to healthcare for everybody is appalling. So, there are these structural problems that exist underneath the major issues. But, you can't change anything in a country unless there's peace. It's the first thing has to be peace. And I just hope and pray every day that there's a way found that the country can come together, that the violence can stop, and that people can start to rebuild their lives.
Teddy.
First, I do want to thank Graham for taking on this challenge, to do this documentary. Really appreciate the hard work, and all the time that you put into this documentary. And also the AAA team that contributed a lot to this documentary, providing feedback to Graham, to our donors. We couldn't have done this without our donors willing to financially support this documentary, and for being patient, because it took a long time, because they were asking, when is it going to come out, when is it going to come out, and also to those 4 individuals that were part of this film, because these are 4 brave people that were willing to be interviewed. They knew that this film is going to go out to the public and there could be retribution. But their story is important because it tells the story of the Amhara genocide in Ethiopia. It's through their life experience that the world now is learning about what's happening to Amharas in Ethiopia. And I really just thankful for their willingness to be part of this film. They've gone through a very difficult time, and for the Amharas in the diaspora, just a challenge. Let's do more. There's we really have the opportunity here, especially for those of us who live in democratic countries, to be part of this democratic process and really push for a change in Ethiopia. We have that opportunity to say, yes, we were part of a positive change, to make a positive difference, for people like these 4 people in this film. And, that's really all that I wanted to say. Thank you for having us on your program, Reeyot.
Thank you so much.